Well, hello everybody. Welcome to this Getting Started series. Today's chapter is going to be talking about access originating from the PC. Not necessarily the old school days of green screen dumb terminals, but using these newfangled things we call laptops and desktops. My name is Robin Tatum. I am the Director of Security Technologies here at Help Systems. And in that role, it is my pleasure to be able to present this type of content for everyone. I am one of the subject matter experts for Common, so I'll be heading to St. Louis here in just a few weeks. So if you are coming, please be sure to stop by or come to some of the sessions. And if you do have any questions on security, be it the content we're talking about today or in anything regarding security, not only on IBMI, but some instances in other areas where we are expanding our reach, feel free to leverage us as your partner in that regard. If you're not familiar with Help Systems or the PowerTech name, sometimes there is a little bit of confusion between the two, but basically PowerTech is a suite of products owned by Help Systems, and so I am a Help Systems employee and represent the PowerTech brand. There is another team that we have that handles security services, and that is led by Carol Woodbury, who was the IBM Chief Security Architect for more than a dozen years. So we're very lucky to have a great team here and in a number of security employees that handle all of those requirements for our customers. We have significant investment in the security space. We're part of the PCI Security Standards Council. We're also authorized by NASBA to issue CPE or continuing education credits for security education, which means these types of sessions are often used to educate auditors. And we're also the publisher of the fantastic and annual State of IBMI Security Report. Why is it fantastic? Well, not only because I'm one of the guys that writes it, but because it is the only study out there of its kind. And if you have never read it, I would definitely invite you to go out to our website, download a copy, and see some of the things that are going on with regards to security on the platform and where people are making the most common mistakes and what they're doing well. So our topic really starts here, and the fact that IBMI has an integrated database. In fact, the I stands for integration. A lot of times people don't know why it was ever called I-Series or System I. Well, IBMI continues that trend. The I is integrated, meaning that all the components typically that have to be added on to a computer system are already there. It's one of the great selling points of the platform and always has been. In fact, the database was there from day one. It just didn't really have a name. In fact, my career started on this platform, and for many years, I had no idea that that was not normal to have a database integrated into the operating system. But it finally got a name. It's DB2, and the benefit of that is that it's fully tested with the operating system, and it's there for everybody to use. Now, there is a challenge from that perspective as well, or maybe an advantage, depending on your perspective. When you're given a user ID and password, you are able to sign onto the system. But that also means then you have access to all other interfaces as well as the database. So when a user is allowed to sign onto the system, we have to consider what they're able to do once they get onto the system, because there is no additional challenge presented to that user in the operating system to provide different credentials. A good example of this is a user who has an expectation of using a green screen interface can also log in with those same credentials into FTP and potentially now download data to a thumb drive or an Excel spreadsheet. And of course, that may not be part of their job responsibilities, and we need to be cognizant of that as security people to ensure that that's not happening without a business requirement. Back in the day, and this is when I started, we dealt with a green screen, and that was a big clunky device that sat on our desk. There was a thick black cord coming out of the back of it called Twinx, and it went directly into the back of the what was called AS400 at the time. Now, the good news from a security perspective is it allowed us to manage the user's functionality without really having to pay too much attention to the security controls on the back end. We gave them a menu that looks like this, and from there, they picked their one of 10 options, and that was all they could do. And then the application took over and managed the functionality itself. Now, the benefit of menu security is that it was extremely easy to then control which applications the user was able to gain access to. The application security itself manage the functionality of the actual application. So can they post checks? Can they enter orders? Those types of things. And both of these approaches are still heavily utilized. We still see a significant portion of the IBMI community leveraging these types of security controls and green screen applications, although many are now moving to more modernized interfaces. But at the end of the day, if we're still using and relying on those interfaces, we have to understand the pros and cons of those types of controls. Certainly the benefit is that it simplifies the process. I can create a menu in about 15 minutes, and my entire security architecture is handled for those green screen users. And so it still remains beneficial, but we have to understand that it has limitations. I've got a note here that it's no longer sufficiently comprehensive, and what I mean by that is that it's not the only way a user potentially can access that database, and we have to acknowledge that, otherwise we could get blindsided. In essence, there are tunnels coming into your database, and where there used to be one tunnel, which was the green screen, we now have multiple. So when the system connection occurs, the user has the potential of going down one of numerous tunnels to actually access the system. And in some instances, the security controls that we currently leverage are going to only pertain to some or maybe only one of the tunnel connections. Here we see an example of down at the bottom of a regular Telnet menu. The user signs in, they get controlled by the menu as we've already discussed, and they gain access to the applications. But what if they connect through ODBC or a JDBC version of that, DDM, FTP? They don't ever get presented with that same menu. Those connections occur directly to the database manager, and the user is then able to perform any task on the database that the operating system has been instructed they're allowed to perform. It used to be that ODBC was a tricky thing to configure, but quite honestly, within 3 or 4 clicks now, most likely you're going to have data appearing in a spreadsheet. So it's not deemed something out of the realm of possibility that a user could figure out. If you're using IBM's emulator, then there's a good chance that you have the ODBC driver already installed, and it's just a matter of selecting that as the data source. Now, I've got a version of Excel here that is not 100% up to date, but here we see transfer data from iSeries, transfer data to iSeries, meaning that Excel has already recognized that there is a data source. In fact, installing IBM Client Access on this particular PC added these menu options directly to the fly down and allow that connection to happen extremely easily. Granted, from a user perspective, this is a fantastic thing. If I want to access the data, I can do so very quickly and very easily, which is a huge benefit to my productivity. I have the data pulled down, I can look at it, I can sort it, I can filter it, I can send it somewhere, and if I'm doing that legitimately as part of my job, then it's nice to know that I'm not being hampered in that process. But what you have to remember that even having simple *use permission to a file permits the reading of that data, not only locally on the host, but also pulling it down to the PC to quote-unquote read it there. Well, once it's on the PC, now it's fair game. I can potentially change it there, I can forward it on, I can stick it on a thumb drive, and if any of that data contains sensitive information, then of course we have a major problem. Back in the day, use permission was kind of seen as the golden goose. That was what we went after. You can't change anything. You can just see it. So what's the big deal? Well, the fact that I can download it with use permission is a huge deal. And if you're dealing with any type of regulatory compliance, then that is a major issue. Now, speaking of regulatory compliance, I'm going to open up just a quick poll here while I'm talking, and I'm curious what you guys are dealing with, if anything, with regards to regulatory compliance. So let me know, do you have a PCI initiative or Sarbanes-Oxley? If you're not currently regulated, don't think that that may not happen. So I always tell people, keep your eye on the prize. Even if you're not dealing with it today, you may want to think about what may come down the pike tomorrow. Now, some of the tools that I've mentioned not only allow data to be pulled down, but in some instances, they can return the data back up. And this is happening without any of the oversight of the core application. For example, I've got payroll on my system, and I just downloaded that salary column that you saw. If I have the ability to download the data and also upload the data, what's to stop me from actually altering that salary field and moving it back to the host? Now, normally, I have to be part of perhaps human resources in order to work with the salary department or with the application. But in this instance now, I'm going directly against the database file. And while the application approach may say, are you sure you want to change that salary by 500%? In this instance, there is no edits, and so the database is actually updated directly, perhaps corrupting the information or updating it in a way, even if not maliciously, with data that does not correspond to the intent. Bear in mind, the operating system does not log this activity, which is unbelievable to most auditors. Yes, if you are auditing the objects, you may see that the file was touched, which may be a red flag, but you're not actually going to get any notification of an authority event just simply involving a transfer. Meaning that while I can detect somebody trying to touch a file that I have indicated they shouldn't, I'm not going to see any type of transfer to a file where they are authorized. And I will tell you, most users are surprisingly authorized to a lot of different things. Now, this type of connectivity typically doesn't require any specialized tools, so don't expect that your users can't do this because they don't have the software that you control. In fact, for example, FTP is included on every Windows desktop. You just bring up a DOS prompt and type FTP. Not very difficult. These functions are very straightforward, they're very quick, and they don't have any type of data parsing, they don't have to deal with application edits, and so that data will just go up. If you have a numeric field, for example, and you upload A, B, C, D, E as a character value, then all of a sudden you're going to have a corrupted database and have no idea how that happened. Now, as an auditor, that is quite concerning, and of course, we don't want to have a free-for-all in our database. It's not just about security, it's also about integrity of the information as well. We have to ensure that everything that our business is making its decisions on is timely and accurate, and the ability for a user to perhaps change data outside of the control of the application is potentially a damaging function. Now, the one-two punch here for IBMI users is that they typically have excessive rights to the application data. We know that for a fact. As I mentioned, we published the State of IBMI Security Study, and I can tell you for the last 8+ years that I've been doing it, there has not been a year that had highly encouraging results of the fact that everybody is kept out like most regulations such as PCI demand. The other thing to bear in mind is the functionality of the operating systems continues to be enhanced. And the expectation by IBM that everybody uses the security controls has unfortunately not been fully followed. Many of the TCP services that these users potentially are accessing are active by default, and therefore there is really nothing stopping that user making these types of connections from their PC. As I mentioned, the State of IBMI Security, this is a chart directly from the 2017 study indicating the number of users that have administrative privileges. Now, the interesting thing here, and from a database perspective, the most important one of all, is this little guy right here, all object on the far left there. There is an average of 200 users on every system that are operating with all object special authority. Well, what is that? Understand that all object authority, as its name suggests, is an authority to all objects without limitation or restriction. Even if I say, Robin, you are excluded from the payroll master file, all object is the global permission and override to that. It's actually evaluated ahead of whether I have any private authorities or restrictions. So as an all object user, I can gain access to any database object that I want. In fact, I can gain access to any object, period, meaning that I could delete the operating system. I could shut the server down. There is virtually nothing I can stop a user with all object from doing. Now, the database itself, behind the scenes, is mostly not secured. In fact, we can see that users that are operating against the database typically have star change permission. Now, in the study, we look at the library level, and there's a little bit more complexity and discussion that needs to happen there. So I understand that this is not a full and unrestricted view, but the bottom line is star change is the default permission supplied in the operating system, and what we see, for the most part, is that systems remain at that supplied default. People create libraries, they create files and applications, and they do not override that default permission. Now, bear in mind, change allows a user to not only read the data, but modify the data. So when we talked about that Excel spreadsheet, yes, you can pull the data down, and yes, you can modify it there and upload it back. And that is the default permission, meaning that the system is wide open. Even use permission, as I mentioned earlier, which used to be kind of treated as the end goal, is enough to be able to pull the data down and export it. And if you're doing that officially, that's great, but without any logging or any type of access control, that becomes very, very challenging and high risk for a data breach. In fact, only 11% of the libraries that we looked at were actually configured as public star exclude, meaning that a user had to be explicitly authorized to gain access to the contents. And I will tell you, most systems that I look at are typically in single digits in that regard. So what this is telling me as a security person is that my database is still heavily reliant on those menus and those applications in order to secure access. Now, the objects that are created within these libraries are not visible to me, but what I can tell you is that the majority of systems that we looked at had a default creation attribute at the library level of star sysval, which means that the decision is actually deferred to a system level attribute, a system value. Now, we followed that chain, and what we determined was that 81% of the systems that had sysval as their default create option were set at public star change. And we also had 14% that were set specifically at star change. So what that tells me is the vast majority of systems are absolutely creating not only libraries, but objects inside the libraries with that public attribute set to star change. Now, what about the services that allow users to actually do something with that data? Certainly, command line restrictions are one way that many of us think of to restrict the functionality of a user. Who cares if they have all objects when they can't type any commands to leverage it? Well, that's a fair argument in a green screen world, but we have to be a little bit more careful when we expand that discussion to something beyond the green screen. FTP, as an example, is set to auto start on the vast majority of systems. Almost all of them have FTP being started the instant the server boots up from an IPL. That means these services are there, they're waiting. And if you remember, the IBMI profiles that are given to the users for the desired applications are also available for logging into other interfaces, including FTP. Now, command line abuse is a common thing. As I mentioned, there is a restriction in the user's profile called limit capabilities that, as one of its primary functions, is to control what commands a user can type on a command line, of course, in the green screen world. It doesn't necessarily change the visibility to the command line. It just controls on a command-by-command basis which commands the user can run. Now, don't get me wrong, I certainly do encourage use of that parameter because it really allows us to restrict, from a green screen perspective at least, whether the user can employ and utilize those administrative privileges that we probably gave the profile, I don't know, 20 years ago, or at least a template that was used to create their profile, to restrict what they can do. And we're a little afraid to take those privileges away because, well, we don't really know if it's going to break something. And there's only one thing that scares us more than security, and that is breaking an existing application. So we have to find ways to do it without such a risk of doing that. Now, of course, we have folks here that can assist with that task. They have a lot of experience with that, but I will tell you a very quick win is take command line permissions away from a user, especially those that really have no administrative requirement to be doing commands like create library or delete library or even work spool file for that matter. You can still put that command on a menu and have the user run it from there. The big thing with command line that I always point out to people in my discussions is that not all of the interfaces available to your users adhere to the command line restriction. So the limit capability setting is not always validated. A good example of this is the delete lib directive under FTP can be run by any user regardless of their limit capability setting. There are other interfaces that don't check any of the commands, so you have to be cognizant of the fact that while a user may be limited on the green screen, all they have to do is come around to the side of the house and walk right in the door. Certainly some users may have a command line requirement. If they do, and I'm talking about administrators and programmers perhaps, then I definitely recommend that auditing be turned on the system and that those profiles be explicitly set to do command auditing. Now, we've discussed auditing in a prior session. If you were not available or did not listen to that, I certainly recommend that you check the recorded links and take a listen. But let me know if that's something that you want to do in the future, and we can absolutely help you get that set up. It takes just a few minutes. So the equation that we're dealt with here is that we have a lot of users, typically with too many privileges. We have open services that are up and listening as soon as the box IPLs, and that represents a very high risk. From an audit compliance perspective, it's certainly a violation, and even from a common sense best practices standpoint, it's not good. We want the database to be open to a degree, but we don't want it to be open to the point where it's abused. So why did IBM do this? Why did they give us these functions? Well, quite simply because we asked for them. We saw the system as closed and proprietary, and in the early 90s that became a high-pressure point. We had tools like Crystal Reports and Microsoft Excel, and they were great at crunching numbers and doing analytics and giving us very valuable business information. But here we had this big iron sitting in the data center, and it wouldn't share. And so we pressured IBM as the user community to open the box up to these modern interfaces. Now, they did that, but IBM also knew behind the scenes that a lot of people had not utilized object-level security as expected because those menus and command line restrictions were very easy to deploy, and most people didn't want to embark on the more complex configuration. As part of that, it was going to be a Pandora's box. Once these database access points were opened, what was to stop a user from doing anything they wanted? Fortunately, IBM added another security layer in. Now, this is something that you have to configure, and there's some work here, but this is a layer that allows you to intercept these connections in those tunnels that I mentioned and actually apply some logic in business restrictions to who can come in and out of them. This process is typically referred to as an exit point. IBM has a number of different exit points throughout the operating system. For example, when you create a user profile, there's an exit point. That exit point is able to register and invoke a program that you write to do something after that task is complete. Maybe when you create a user, you also want to enroll them in your ERP or create a work library for them. Now, in those instances, those exit points summon the exit program after the process is complete. So there's nothing you can do in that create user profile exit program to prevent the profile from being created. But there are also other exit points that do get invoked or invoke their exit program before the process is honored. And we have an example of almost 30 different exit points specifically pertaining to network or PC access that will have an exit point associated with them that will check when a transaction comes through the tunnel to see if there is an exit program available. If it is, then it will invoke the exit program, telling it who the user is, what they're asking to do, where they came from, like their IP address, and then it waits for that exit program to make a decision, indicating whether that is a desirable connection or transaction. If it is, then it continues on its way and the operating system will attempt to perform it. It doesn't guarantee it will be performed because if I'm trying to download, say, the payroll master and I have set the payroll master to not allow Robin access, then of course the operating system is not going to allow me to do it. But let's say I do have access to the payroll master. The exit program is able to set the flag to say, no, Robin is not in human resources and I don't want him downloading that payroll master file. Now, there's two functions that I want the exit program to do. One is to audit the connection request. If Robin is downloading a file, even if authorized, I'd like to log it, because the operating system, as I mentioned before, does not do a good job of that. I also need to apply access control. Think of an exit program in the exit points as kind of putting a firewall around the system. Not a traditional firewall. We're not looking for, say, denial of service attacks, but what we're doing now is more of an application firewall. It is intercepting the request and saying, does the business desire this type of connection? Is the user in that type of position that what they're asking to do would be reasonable? And so with those two criteria being met, we can actually augment the operating system's own security controls and in some instances offset the risk of not having some of those implemented in order to provide better security. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a big proponent on object-level security. Our team helps lots of customers implement that, and I treat that as the solid foundation that everything else is built on. It can't be circumvented, right? So it is absolutely a desirable state, but I also am realistic to know in my tenure working in this community that most of us don't have object-level security implemented and probably won't, at least in the foreseeable future. So the fact that we can throw a menu in front of a green screen user and throw an exit program in front of a PC user means that we can manage the threat without necessarily allowing the user in and out, okay? So are we using these exit programs? Well, one of the things we look at in the study is whether there are any exit programs deployed to the exit points. Now, the chart on the left shows whether there are any exit programs registered to those almost 30 different exit points. And what we see is basically 3/4 of the systems that we looked at, even in 2017, did not have any exit programs registered. Now, bear in mind, IBMI had the exit points added in the mid-90s. So we're talking 20 years after they were introduced. 3/4 of the systems on our network do not have any exit program coverage, meaning we are fully reliant on this object-level security, which often is not correctly or at all configured. Now, when we raise the bar a little bit and say all of the exit points have to be covered, now we're to 91% of the systems not compliant. So if you are operating in an IBMI environment and you are not completely aware of whether or not you have exit programs deployed, this is arguably one of the highest risk areas and something that I would investigate immediately. Now, whether you have full coverage, which usually indicates that you're using a commercial exit program, or whether you have partial coverage, which is usually suggesting you either have added one or two of your own, maybe you've heard about it, or they're not being used for security purposes. Now, bear in mind, an exit program doesn't make you more secure. It's what the exit program does. In other words, you can have malicious exit programs that are intercepting your requests, and that's certainly something that you don't want. So what we try to gain here is an advantage. We're using full coverage across all the exit points, and we want those programs to do the audit and the control functions that I mentioned a moment ago. So do we really need these? Well, my answer is absolutely yes. Exit programs are going to help offset some of the risk associated with the lack of configuration that we see on almost every system in the operating system security controls. It allows us to limit access and make sure it is desired. It allows us to also audit and log all of those connection requests. If you're sitting there thinking, but I'm one of the few that has object-level security in place. Well, I certainly commend you. I kind of joke that object-level security is like unicorn security. It sounds really cool, but honestly, I've never seen it. Now, the reality is certainly some people have a modicum of object-level security. So how does this pertain to you? First of all, I'm a big believer in layering the security controls. In other words, don't rely on one thing, because if somebody gets through that one single layer, suddenly it becomes a free-for-all. And most IBMI systems rely on nothing more than the user ID and password. Once the user connects, it's a free-for-all. And just imagine if somebody hacks your environment, they're not going to connect to the system anonymously. They're going to somehow gain those credentials. They're either going to break a password, maybe from another website, or they're going to do some social engineering, but ultimately they're going to connect to the system as somebody. And we want to make sure that that somebody is intentional. Most of the data that we look at is not as secure as most people think it is. There's a lot of misunderstanding in the IT teams that this has been implemented. And let's face it, for most of us, it's an inherited environment. We have stepped in, we have no idea how it was originally architected, and we end up with an environment that is less secure than we believed. The authority for data does carry through to all environments. So if I am given change rights in the green screen, I'm also running with change rights through FTP or DDM. That can be a good thing or a bad thing, but let's face it, most users connecting to the system use interfaces in different ways. I may have a requirement to change data through the green screen application, and my menus make sure I don't do anything more than that. But when it comes to downloading it through Excel, maybe I'm okay with you seeing it, but I don't want you changing it and uploading it, because if I do, I don't have any record of it, and I don't have any edits to ensure that the data is not being corrupted. We've got to make sure that those things are differentiated between, and an exit program can help you with that. Last but certainly not least, we have command line permissions still being able to be circumvented. So even if you scratch off the idea that somebody is doing something to your database, how about the idea that they're potentially deleting a library, right? And if you have command line restrictions set, you may be resting a little too easily thinking that you are secure, only to find out a savvy user can issue a delete lib through an FTP prompt, and all of a sudden the library disappears. Now, one way you can determine if you are utilizing exit programs is to run a security scan using some software we have developed. Great news here, guys. This is free software. You can run this against your system, and it will identify security vulnerabilities across multiple different categories, one of which is whether you currently have exit programs employed to oversee those PC connections. So take advantage of this. I'll have a question at the end for you. If you are interested, we can absolutely get this run for you. And I know a bunch of people have already run it. So the big question I typically get when I talk about exit points and exit programs is, that's great, I kind of get the concept, where do I get these exit programs from? Well, as you can see, you've got two basic options. Number one is you write your own. IBM created this facility with the intent that people would simply create these programs. And quite honestly, if you are just simply looking to prevent any connection through these interfaces, that's usually what I tell people to do. All that program has to do is receive the necessary parameters, set the flag to deny the request, and then terminate, right? Pretty simple stuff. Unfortunately, for most of us, we need to do more complex processing. We need to make decisions based on who the user is, what they're asking to do, or which object or file they're trying to perhaps upload or download. In that instance, then, we start to get a little bit more complex. That's especially true with connections that are managing SQL connections, ODBC and JDBC type stuff. We have to know and be able to parse out that SQL statement to see, does it contain a command? Is there a SQL injection request coming through? Is it a database request to a file that the user should have access to in that capacity? So all of a sudden now I have to write a parsing engine, which is not for the faint of heart, and if you don't do it correctly, you can certainly introduce performance challenges to the system. Of course, you have to test these programs every time you do an OS upgrade, and if you are dealing with auditors or some type of regulatory mandate, just know that the idea of your programmers writing programs that are designed to please your programmers is not high on their list of things they like to see, in which case you, of course, have a conflict of interest there, and that will be a challenge. Now, again, if all you're trying to do is block all traffic for that particular interface, take advantage of the examples that are online and just create a simple shell program and shut the request down. And at least that way, you can box the user back into a green screen environment. Of course, in our efforts to ensure that this system has amazing longevity and the people understand that this box is not an AS400, it is an IBM I, running a power system on a power system server, then we have to accept the fact that modernizing our applications is a very beneficial way of showing the intrinsic value of this incredible piece of technology. And by doing that, of course, we're using these interfaces as designed. We just have to ensure that people are not abusing them. Now, the second option, much simpler option, but not quite as cheap, of course, is to purchase your exit programs. PowerTech is the leading provider of exit programs, and again, that is the security brand within Help Systems. We have a product called Network Security that, in essence, provides all of the exit programs that you need to manage these PC connections, and they are written in such a way that you can basically design rules within the software, so there's no coding requirement, and you specify the rules about who can do what and when, and in essence then allow those users that have legitimate access requirements to do their job, but to prevent anybody else from coming in. Now, the big caveat or the big warning I will give you in regards to exit programs, as I said before, is if somebody is trying to hack your system, they are most likely not going to go out to IBM.com, put a copy of Client Access or Access Client Solutions into their shopping basket, purchase that software, install it, configure it, and then try to hack you through a green screen. What they're going to do is hit you through scripts, and they're going to get onto your network and they're going to hit industry standard protocols like FTP and ODBC, because quite honestly, they probably don't even know it's an IBMI server, and they're going to get responses. And if they are able to break credentials, which I can tell you in an IBMI world is not difficult based on the horrible practice many of us have with regards to password complexity and password length, then once they get in, like I said before, it becomes an open system and quite the free-for-all. So this is definitely something that you want to look at. The network security tool is configured in a way that allows at least alerting to that right out of the box, and if you want to configure rules, which I recommend, to control the access as well, then it becomes a much simpler task. Now, we are going to be hosting another webinar on August 22nd. Some of the content that you're hearing today will be repeated in there because it's going to be more of a standalone, but we are also going to have some visibility to network security specifically. I didn't want to do that today because we want to make this all educational, and some people want to write their own and they don't want necessarily to purchase third-party applications. But if you are one of the many that prefer not to deal with that headache, then this is a good opportunity for you to get some exposure to a very powerful and simple way to address this issue without having to actually pick up any tools yourself. The perfect IBMI security storm really comes about because we have security awareness levels that are pretty low amongst the community. Right? There's a ton of you on here today, and I'm excited about that. I appreciate you showing up, and there's a lot more content to come in the couple of sessions that are coming after this in the Get It Started series. But it also speaks to the fact that IBMI folks in general, and I was one of these, don't really have a lot of exposure to the security tools. We are managing the systems. We know how to do LPAR setup. We know how to do role swaps. We know how to do work management. But nobody ever taught us about security. Even as a developer myself, my goal was to get an application into the hands of the user as quickly as possible. We did not originally spend a lot of time worrying about the fact that a user may be accessing the database without permission. For most platforms, audit community keeps us honest. They hold our feet to the fire, but in the IBMI world, those auditors often don't know the vulnerabilities and loopholes of the platform. Often they're using a checklist that, is back from 1992 that they grabbed off IBM.com, and they really don't understand the platform. So they're not helping us help ourselves. So we have to, of course, educate those folks, but we also have to take responsibility. It's not just about, oh, thank goodness I passed the audit. It's also about the fact that if you think in those terms, you're missing the point that that auditor is hopefully there partially to make your system more secure. Of course, we use these servers for a reason. They are phenomenal pieces of hardware. They contain tremendous amounts of data that we have been collecting over the years. Many of us use these for our line of business applications, be it distribution or ERPs, manufacturing, and so we have a ton of valuable data there. And this information is typically not secured. We have a wide open database. We don't ever configure the controls to lock it down. We assume a user wouldn't try to do something or know how to do something, but those profiles are far too powerful. They have all object. They have change permission to the database. And so we have that risk that once a profile connects, they can do anything they want. What we've seen today is most of that data can be accessed very easily via a PC interface, and in most instances, without generating any type of log. So I can steal your data, and unlike stealing your car, where you'll notice when you go home that your car is missing from the parking lot, when I steal your data, there's no flag, there's no change because the original object is still residing where it was you left it, but I now have a duplicate of it, and I can do anything that I want once I get it down to my device. If you're interested in learning more about IBM I Security, as I mentioned, the State of IBM I Security study is a great download. It's from the website. If you have any issues with that, let us know. But this is something that we've been publishing since 2004, so we really have a lot of unique insight into what folks are doing well and doing wrong. And that's another session that we do in a webinar form as well, so you can always check out that recording. The other recommendation I have is, of course, the Security Reference Manual, but if that's a little bit overwhelming to you, then Carol Woodbury, who's a Health Systems team member here, has written a phenomenal book called IBM I Security. This is the second edition, but it's actually second edition in this format. It's actually about the fifth, I think, iteration of the book, and it has everything that you need to know broken down. It's good through version 7.3. I did include the link here, but if you just go out to MC Press Online, there's usually a sidebar image. Just make sure you get the, if you're going to buy it, get the cover that has this coloring that indicates that it's the second edition, and that is good through version 7.3. So if you are not yet at 7.3, or if you're there and want to know what's new, this is great because it does include information about the new authority collection services that will help you set up object-level security. So lots of really great information there for you to use as well. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm also going to close the poll. I'm going to let you know, looks like PCI was our winner today, 36% of you dealing with PCI. So not surprising. I do get a lot of calls on PCI. We have Sarbanes-Oxley at 29%, HIPAA at 22%, other at 21%. So it looks like the vast majority of you are dealing with some form of regulation, but about a quarter of you don't currently have, but of course, as I said before, that could change at any time. Now I've got a second poll here just to keep you honest and give me some feedback here. I'm going to open that up. Feel free if you're posting a question to wrap that up, but just curious, if you've ever read the State of IBM I Security study, are you guys taking advantage of that? Are you using exit programs? Maybe you have some exit programs, maybe you have a full complement of them. Maybe you'd never heard of them before today, so I'm curious as to what you're doing there. Are you planning to take any action based on what you've heard today? Is this something that you feel that you need to react to? And if you are interested in one of those free, no-obligation security scans, feel free to take advantage of that. If you'd like to know more about it before you make a decision, let us know that too, and we'd be happy to let you know what that's all about. It's a scan. It takes about 60 seconds or so to run, but we'll give you about an hour's worth of a consultant's time. Again, no cost, no obligation even for that part, in order to explain that to you and how it all works. So we do hundreds of those every year, so it's a really beneficial function, and of course gives us an opportunity to demonstrate expertise as well. So I'm not going to say that we don't see benefit out of it, but absolutely take advantage of that. It gives you a tangible document on your end. You don't have to share the data with us if you don't want to. It's all self-contained, and you can run it on a production system in the middle of the day. So take advantage of that. All right, let's see here. I'm just going to put this slide up. If you're not signed up for the August 17 session, if you want to learn something about user privileges like all object, then take advantage of that. And then we have another session following that one. I don't have the date off the top of my head, but that's going to be about the integrated file system, which is arguably one of the most overlooked areas of IBM I Security. So take advantage of that, and that's going to be presented by Sandy Moore. All right, so let me look at some questions here and see what we've got. Dan, you had a really long one, so let me wait on that one just for a second here. So Steve, you're asking, can network security control the DB2 database application? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. What it's doing is intercepting the outside requests coming in, okay? So if somebody is on a green screen already, consider them as already in, and therefore their access would be controlled through a combination of menus, command line restrictions, and DB2 security configuration. So that would be something where, depending on what you mean by controlling the application, it absolutely can define who can access it from outside, and of course log it. All right, let's see. Carrie, I'm going to take your question offline. It's a little bit more about the perimeter firewall, which IBMI does have included in it. So we'll get back to you on that one. A couple of you are asking about links to the recording. The answer is absolutely yes. If I still have my recorder running, which hopefully I do, yep, we'll make sure everybody gets a link to that. We typically send a follow-up, most likely yet this afternoon. So if you don't see that, check your spam folder, and hopefully you can take advantage of that. Peter, where will the solution reside and be administered? Well, it depends. It is actually a native IBMI application, as most of our applications are. There is a help systems interface known as Insight. That is a technology that we have designed that is pertinent to all of the many help systems product lines, and it's a unified user experience. It's web-based. It's a responsive design, meaning it will work on a tablet, a phone, or a regular workstation monitor, and it's a really great way of doing things. So you're welcome to use that. It has dashboards in it and things, central administration, so you can take advantage of that. If you're old school and prefer green screen, there's a green screen interface too, right? So there are benefits to using the web interface for things like dashboards, but if it's just core administration that you want to do, you can make your choice. You can do it on the green screen if you wish. Let's see here. Carrie, again, I'm going to take that one offline because it's specific to a particular application vendor, and we'll talk about that. Peter, you had a question on training, question mark. Training for what? If you're talking about the network security product, of course, we can always do training on our products. If you're talking about security in general, hopefully this is helpful in that regard. Okay, you clarified for this product. Yeah, absolutely. We would help you get it up and running. We have customers that choose to only audit the data coming on and off their system, or requests coming on and off their system, and it's actually pre-configured to do that. So you install it, and in essence, you're done. Now, for me, if I have a tool that allows me to control that access, then I'm absolutely going to take advantage of that capability, and I'm going to configure it to do that. And that's something that, first of all, you have to understand the traffic coming in and out before you can decide what's good and what's bad and what should happen and what shouldn't. So we put it into this audit mode initially so that you can get visibility for the first time as to who's using these interfaces. Because quite honestly, right now, without exit programs, you can't tell me. You may have, suspicions as to who uses them, but there's no way to know for sure because the operating system doesn't log them. So that's the first step. And then from the information that you glean out of that audit, then you can make decisions as to, if you have an HA application, for example, obviously that needs to do its function, and you set a rule to allow it. So again, think of it as a firewall. You're going to set your rules of who can punch through it and who's going to be deflected back. If Robin has no business requirement to use an ODBC connection, I'm going to block him, and I'm also going to notify somebody through a message or some type of notifier if I try to connect, because that, of course, is the red flag we all need to be looking for. The fact that somebody is trying and failing may not be a security issue per se, but it's certainly a high-risk indicator that somebody is trying to exploit the system. All right, so let's see here. Dan, you say you come from a Unix background, and it's a little bit different with regards to object permissions and what they mean in terms of Unix permissions. So, IFS terminology is more in a Unix read, write, execute world. The difference now between read, write, execute and what we talk of in native terms is that we have an extra category of permissions. So we have really two different categories on a native object. There are data permissions, which are the read, write, and execute that you're familiar with, but we also have object permissions, and you've listed, operational management existence rights, for example. They are what we call object authorities. Now, overall, we refer to them typically as object authorities, but really it's two different categories. Now, each of those authorities are going to allow a user to do different things. For example, object existence rights allows a user to delete an object, so you have to have that. Interestingly, read, write, execute does not include object existence permissions. So read, write, execute does not allow you to delete an object. And so that's sometimes the complexity and difference between what we're used to on the native side of the house and what happens in the Unix side. So there's really no Unix equivalent, for example, of star all permission, which would give all of those object permissions as well. Obviously, this is something that is a fairly deep topic. I would strongly recommend, if you're new to IBM security, take advantage of the book by Carol Woodbury, and it will help explain a lot of this stuff. I think that will probably be the best investment you could make if you are responsible here for IBM security. All right. If you do want more info, happy to give it. Just don't want to take 2 hours to do it here, and I would be happy. So let me know if you need more help on that, and we'll be more than happy to explain it a little bit further. All right. I think I had answers to most of those. Oh, Larry. How effective is it to block ODBC and FTP access via iNavigator's application administration? Very common question, so thank you for asking that. iNav has a lot of functionality in it. So first of all, my recommendation is do not install it on an end-user desktop, certainly without doing a very restricted install. By default, that gets thrown on there. It allows access to IFS file shares, which are potentially then going to be avenues that viruses and ransomware can impact your system. Yes, folks, that can happen, and I've seen it. FTP and other interfaces can be started and stopped. So iNav is very, very powerful. Now, it contains a function in there called application administration, and that allows you to do some restrictions with regards to who can do what. Now, think of it as poor man's exit programs. Now, there are some things that can be done in application administration that are easier than doing through exit programs. For example, if a user works with their spool files, through the exit program, you will see the invocation of a Q-named program by IBM. It's very hard then to know, well, what was the user doing that invoked that program, in which case application administration is actually quite helpful. When it comes to more granular control over the database access and things like that, hands down, the exit program is the way to go. But again, it's not mutually exclusive. Why not use both? Application administration is a layer, as is exit programs, as is object-level security, as is menus. Now, you try to make those layers transparent to the legitimate users, but they become hurdles to somebody who is doing something outside of their responsibilities, and so we can absolutely take advantage of that. All right. Darren, you're asking just for a quick explanation of exit programs again because you joined late. What I'm going to do is I'm going to defer you to the recording link, and if you have any questions after you listen to that, please feel free to reach out. I'll be more than happy to clarify or explain further, but that's probably the best way for you to catch up on the pieces that you missed. All right, let me close out the poll here, and we'll see what we've got. If you are in the midst of answering that, you got about 20 seconds to wrap that up, so go ahead. Looks like we've got a pretty even split between people that have read the study, that have not read the study, and that hadn't read the study but are now planning to. So good, take advantage of that. We love publishing that study. It's a scary thing. I have a great presentation on that that scares the bejesus out of most people, but it's hopefully a catalyst for people making change and improving the situation. Looks like 27% of you not using exit programs at all, 12% are using some based on things that you wrote, a third of you using commercial exit programs, so you guys are ahead of the curve there, which is good, and 27% don't know. So hopefully those are the ones that said they want a security scan so we can help you understand that. 76% of you, overwhelming, are planning to take action based on what you have seen today. So that typically means putting some controls on the users and, of course, assessing the benefit of exit programs programs in your environment. So let us know if we can help you with that, and we can absolutely steer you in the right direction. And if you have indicated, if you're one of the ones that have indicated you're interested in a security scan, we'll reach out, we'll get that set up. If you wanted more information, we'll certainly be happy to answer any questions, and you can then decide if you want to take advantage of that free offer and get some insight. All right, well, that's it, folks. I appreciate everybody joining today. Hopefully this was an enjoyable session. I look forward to seeing you on August 17th, so sign up for that if you haven't already. And then, as I mentioned,